Okay, we're now on to part three, the last part of the nervous system, and this one's going to be the shortest. So we don't have a lot to cover, but it is very important. So let's get started with part three. Part three, we will discuss motor units, conduction of impulses, which we already talked about, so that's going to be a review, and then neural adaptations to training. So first, let's talk about what is a motor unit. So first we have to know what a motor neuron is, and we learned about motor neurons in part one. You see this word here, alpha motor neuron. That's just a more specific type of motor neuron, but we're just concerned with the motor neuron. But a unit is the neuron and all the fibers that it innervates. So let's look at a motor unit. So here's our spinal cord. And then the motor neurons branch off the spinal cord, and they're going to innervate a group of fibers. So a motor unit is the neuron. So let's pull out this green one here. So motor neuron number one is the green one, and then it connects to like 3 of those fibers. That's a motor unit. And then we have motor unit 2, which is the purple motor unit. So this purple motor neuron is going to attach to those 2 fibers right there. That's a separate motor unit. So you get it. It's the neuron and the fibers. So we already know an alpha motor or a motor neuron has short dendrites and a long axon. So those long axons travel all the way from the spinal cord to a muscle. That's a pretty long way. And it carries impulses from the cell body of that neuron, which is all the way up here in the spinal cord, to the terminal buttons, which is also referred to as the neuromuscular junction when it connects to a muscle. So these red guys here, those are muscle fibers, so in a muscle. The neuromuscular junction, or NMJ, is that connection. It's the synapse. Remember when we talked about synaptic transmission? Well, the same process occurs at the muscle fiber, but it's referred to as the neuromuscular junction when it connects to that muscle. So let's talk more about these motor units here. So a motor neuron will determine the fiber type properties. So we already know there are different fiber types. We've already covered chapter 4. You know all about the fiber types. When talking about this motor unit though, all the muscle fibers in a motor unit are the exact same type. So basically the nervous system controls the muscular system. The muscle properties are controlled by the type of neuron that innervates it. So here's a bicep. So let's look at the biceps muscle, and then let's pull out a muscle. So right here, here's the muscle. This is just an example. We have more than 3 motor units in the biceps. We have upwards of like 100 motor units in the biceps. So, okay, motor unit number 1, let's say this is a slow motor unit. So the neuron itself is smaller, it's slower, meaning that the muscle fibers, the fiber type of motor unit number 1 are type 1. They're slow twitch. All right, now let's say that motor unit number 2 is a little bit larger than motor unit number 1. Those fibers are larger, the signal travels a little bit faster, or the conduction speeds faster. This may be a type 2, but it may be a smaller type 2. And then let's say a motor unit 3 is like really large, the neuron itself is large, the fibers are large. Well, it's probably going to be type 2 fibers, or those fast twitch fibers. So this just shows you that there's a mixture of all 3 different motor units in a muscle. Let's talk about more about recruitment thresholds needed to fire an action potential at the hillock. So this gets us into thresholds, which we know a little bit about thresholds already. So there are different sized motor units that have various thresholds of activation needed to be reached in order for those fibers to contract. So type 1 we know are slow twitch. They're going to be innervated by those smaller motor neurons. and they have a lower threshold. What does that mean? That means they're easier to recruit. They're recruited first due to the lower activation. So let's say their activation is that -60 or -55 millivolts, just like the normal threshold level that we just learned about. But they're easy to activate, meaning that it doesn't take a lot of effort. That when you stand up and walk around, you aren't doing very much, but you still need motor units to do that movement. You're going to recruit your type 1 fibers to stand up and walk around. They're easy to activate, meaning they're lower threshold. But type 2, fast twitch, innervated by larger motor neurons, are higher threshold, meaning they take a lot more effort. They're more difficult to recruit. They're recruited after all the type 1s have been recruited, and that higher threshold level of activation is more negative. So it could be like -70, -75, -80 millivolts, -90 millivolts. It's more negative, meaning it takes more effort to recruit those. The strength training 3322, which is now 4305, goes into so much more detail about recruitment of type 1 and type 2. But we'll continue to talk about it in just a second. But let's talk about this picture down here. Difference in number of fibers per motor unit. This is called the innervation ratio. So innervation ratio is basically the number of muscle fibers per motor unit. It depends on the size of the muscle and the force required by that muscle. So smaller muscles need more precise control of force. They may only have 5 to 10 muscle fibers per motor unit, like this little blue motor unit down here. This would be like a muscles in, like a muscle in the hand or muscle in the eye. It's very precise movements and can't produce a lot of force. Therefore, we just need smaller number of fibers, so fewer fibers per unit. But up here, we have a large motor unit. Larger muscles need more dynamic control to produce greater amounts of force. So let's say like muscle in the rectus femoris or the gluteus maximus. Those muscles, those motor units contain more muscle fibers. Upward of 500 to 1,000 muscle fibers per one motor unit, meaning that this red neuron right here, there's just one neuron, but it's going to innervate, it's going to activate 1,000 muscle fibers. That's pretty crazy to think about. But the average number of muscle fibers per motor unit is 100. So about 100 fibers per one motor unit on average in the human body. Let's talk about the size principle of recruitment. This is the last question on your assignment. So this is an important critical thinking part. I'm just going to give you the information about this principle, and then you're going to have to put it in your own words to come up with the critical thinking part. Okay, so motor units recruited from smallest to largest. We've probably already gathered that. We know that our type 1s are recruited first, followed by our small type 2s, and then our really large type 2s. Recruitment is accomplished by varying the strength of the stimulus needed to stimulate each one of those fibers. Each muscle possesses a specific motor unit pool that can be activated depending on the force requirement of the activity. This has to do with motor unit excitability. So how many motor units are active in a muscle is determined by the amount of stimulus sent to a given muscle to increase that recruitment. So we start down over here. This is our threshold stimulus, and down here is the proportion of the motor units excited. So this is a muscle. So this right, the circle is the muscle. And then each of these little dots are the motor units. And if the motor unit is red, it means it's active. So over here, we're looking at like the voltage, like how many motor units are we activating. If you notice here, stimulus 1 and 2 did not even reach the threshold. Therefore, there is no activity in the muscle. So the muscle is not active because there was not enough stimulus. It did not reach the threshold. But here in 3, we did reach the threshold, but it was just a normal stimulus. Maybe like 1 action potential or 2 action potentials were sent to the muscle, we may only activate a small number of motor units. And then as the stimulus gets bigger, so as we have more motor units sent to the muscle, that's going to more action potential sent to the muscle, that's going to recruit more motor units, as you see here. So as we reach maximal stimulus, there's a maximal stimulus in the muscle, all the motor units are going to be recruited up to like this 10 part right here. So basically, to summarize this right here, small stimulus is not enough to reach the threshold. Therefore, no motor units will be activated. Larger the stimulus sent to the muscle will recruit multiple motor units to produce a greater amount of force. So what you have to do, and this next slide will help with that as well, is the question on your assignment asks about the difference between size principle of recruitment for aerobic exercise versus anaerobic exercise, which you already know the difference here. But let me keep going with this topic, and then you can think about that critical thinking question later. Okay, so this is a practical application, and it has to do with weightlifting. Okay, so when we lift lighter weights for high number of repetitions, like high volume, we're only recruiting our type 1 fibers. So we see down here, low force, low recruitment threshold. Low threshold fibers are recruited when the task force is very low. And those are here. So 12 to 20 RM, that's a repetition maximum. High volume, light load. We just need type 1s to do that. We don't need anything larger. But now let's get up here. Force production increases. We move to like a 6 to 10 RM. So 6 to 10 reps at maximal effort, or 1 to 5 reps at maximal effort. Heavy weight, low repetitions, low volume. Now we have to recruit those high threshold fibers for strength or for power training. So that's the size principle of recruitment. It depends on the force at hand, or the task at hand, and how much force we have to produce. Low level of force, only type 1s are needed. High level of force, we need type 1s and type 2s to do the job. All right, next concept is the all or nothing law, which was already discussed, I think, in video number 1. So we should know this already. But it's talking about that stimulus that doesn't reach the threshold. But let's now apply it to motor unit activation. So motor unit activation determined by threshold level. We already know that. So what happens if the threshold is reached for a given motor unit? The answer is every single muscle fiber in that given motor unit will activate. So if we reach the threshold for a motor unit, like that motor neuron, the action potential is sent down the motor neuron, all the fibers that motor neuron innervates, they will all contract. They will all activate. What if it is not reached? So what if we don't reach the threshold for a specific motor unit? Then none of the fibers will activate in the motor unit. So if the neuron does not fire, then the motor unit will not contract. So very, very simple law to understand. So how do we produce force then? So where does force production come from? Force production comes from the more motor units that we can activate. So that's just called multiple motor unit summation. So more motor units equals more force. That's also a pretty easy one to understand. Think about the biceps. If I just lift up my cell phone, I don't need a lot of motor units to activate. And there's very low amount of force. But if I try to lift up this desk that I'm sitting at, I am going to have to recruit more motor units. And the more motor units I recruit, the more force I can produce. Wave summation is kind of another term to describe how force increases slowly as we recruit more individual fibers. So gradations of force. A gradation is like a stair stepper in force production. It's achieved by controlling the force of individual motor units. So gradations in force are developed by the muscle also achieving and controlling the force produced by individual motor units. Wave summation is defined as the product of the rapidity of which an action potential generated by the motor neuron to stimulate the muscle fibers. And last is rate coding. So rate coding is the neuron's ability to vary the rate at which those action potentials occur at the muscle. So this picture down here, over here we have tension, which is also force, and down here we have the stimulus. So the stimulus is the action potential. So one stimulus will cause like a muscle twitch. But when we have multiple stimulus like occur together, that's called rate coding. When we increase the rate at which these little stimuli occur, that produces wave summation. So when we rate code a muscle, that causes wave summation. You see our stair stepper in force production, how force is slowly increasing as we stimulate the muscle more and recruit more motor units. This picture explains it as well. So down here we have an EMG signal. So this is the activity in the muscle, okay? Up here we have an action potential. So the action potential occurs, and the action potential is very brief. One action potential produces a very low amount of force. So very little. A single twitch is nothing. We've all felt a muscle twitch before. And then this next picture shows a pair of action potentials. So the arrow is the first one, and we see this first wave. But then before the muscle can completely relax back to baseline, another action potential is sent to the muscle. And now look, the force increased. This is that wave summation. This is the summation of two twitches. And then they can increase and increase and increase. Over here, we have a series of action potentials sent to the muscle. This here is rate coding. When we keep stimulating the muscle, we see here the activity in the muscle keeps increasing, and then these action potentials just occur on top of each other over and over and over again until the muscle reaches something called a tectonic force, or tetanus. This is no evidence of relaxation between action potentials sent to the muscle, and they're sent at really high frequencies. This is a summation of force, the highest amount of force in a muscle. The ability to vary force of a muscle is produced by multiple motor unit summation and the rate coding of that muscle. Varying the force is vital for performance. And we know that it's important for athletic skills ranging from power events to muscular endurance. So basically, what we see is a muscle is being stimulated before it can relax, and that's how we have greater force production. All right, let's move on to adaptations. Let's think, okay, we just did a training program, a resistance training program. And that resistance training program was 16 weeks long. And we started training and we got stronger and stronger and we can lift heavier. Let's talk about what are all those adaptations that occurred. So one of the primary adaptations to the central nervous system is an increase in neural drive. We have more neural drive to the muscle. This is a measure of both motor unit recruitment and rate coding, meaning that when we are more trained, we can recruit more motor units and we have the ability to rate code them. This just allows us to be stronger. So increased muscle strength is caused by an increase in neural drive. One cause of increased strength is neural drive. We also have increased motor unit firing rate, which is a product of neural drive. Increased synchronization of firing. This is basically where we decrease the time it takes to reach peak force, so we are able to produce force faster. So it's more of a product of power. And then increased contractile response at submaximal neural drive. So think of like just a workout that's non-maximal. You're still stronger. You have a greater contraction even at submaximal loads. Let's look at the time course of change. So how long does it take to see these changes? Okay, so first we see here, first 4 to 6 weeks of training, we see an increase in strength. We're getting stronger, but what does that do to neural mechanisms? So let's look at this picture here. So this is our progress, and it's looking at both strength and hypertrophy. So growing our muscles and getting stronger. This is our training time. How many weeks have we been resistance training? So here's 8 weeks, 16, 24, 32. All right, so from 0 to 8 weeks, so about 2 months of training, what happens? Let's follow the blue line. We are getting stronger. Our strength is improving. We're able to lift heavier. What's that due to? Look, the orange line is also increasing with the blue. The orange line is neural. So the first 4 to 6 weeks of a training program, we are getting stronger. That's mainly due to all the neural changes. So all the changes that occur at the central nervous system. What about hypertrophy? Is our muscle getting bigger during that time as well? Look here, the green. We may see small changes, but they may not start occurring until week about 3-4. So week 3 to 4, we may start to see changes to the muscle, but they're not the primary contributor to strength. We're still getting larger, but not contributing to how much force we can produce until after those 16 weeks there. So let's look here. So at 8 weeks, that's when most training studies occur. So most training studies look here. And then we see all our serious strength trainers, like our people who've been lifting weights for years. Let's look at what has happened to their adaptations. So after 8 weeks, we see the neural adaptations kind of level off. So they don't decrease, they stay. So we don't lose them. They just stop forming. But what increases is hypertrophy. So from 8 to 16 weeks of a training program, that's when the muscles will start to grow the most. And then they're going to surpass the contribution that neural adaptations give to our strength gains. So after about 16 weeks is when we keep getting stronger. And what's that due to? It's now due to the size of the muscle. Now the size of the muscle is what's causing the increases in strength. But the first 6 weeks is neural, and then after that, strength or hypertrophy starts to contribute more. Okay, last slide, and this part here is again where I would turn it over to the class and you guys would talk about what you kind of think the difference between motor unit recruitment of a marathon runner. Here's our Galen Roop, our marathon runner, and then LaShawn Merritt is our 400-meter sprinter. So y'all are just kind of talking about the differences. This is going to help you answer your critical thinking on chapter 5, or on the assignment, but I'm not really going to give you the answers. I'm just going to kind of tell you what to think about. So think about the difference between synchronous recruitment and asynchronous recruitment. Also, think about type 1 motor unit recruitment versus type 2 fiber motor unit recruitment. Think about the size of the motor neuron or motor unit pool. So think about if we're recruiting like 50% of our motor units or 100% of our motor units in a muscle. And then think about the size principle versus something called selective recruitment. Selective recruitment goes against the size principle. It's where the body chooses to recruit certain muscle fibers over other muscle fibers. But yeah, you guys can do some research on that and kind of take what I gave you to answer that question. But very last thing is the chapter 5 quiz review. So you can take a picture of this and save this and then make your little study guide for your chapter 5 quiz. But that's it. That's all I have for your chapter 5. So I hope you enjoyed watching these videos and learned a lot. So you can now answer your Chapter 5 assignment and then also take that quiz when you're ready.